The legal requirements for consent for use and storage of samples for research, depending on whether the samples are from the living or the dead, whether they're from England, Wales or Northern Ireland, or they're being imported from outside these countries, whether they're existing holdings, or if they are from living donors and the samples are anonymised and there's NHS rec approval, or whether the samples are being held with the view of conducting DNA analysis on the samples. It's always best practice to seek free, fully informed consent in any circumstances. Consent falls within the Human Tissue Authority's statutory remit. Consent under the Act relates to the purpose for which the material might be removed, stored or used. The purposes which are covered under the consent for the HTA Act are set out in Schedule 1 of the Act and are called scheduled purposes. In broad terms, the Human Tissue Act and the HTA's codes of practice require that consent is required to store and use dead bodies, remove, store and use relevant material from a dead body, and to store and use relevant material from the living. Under the Human Tissue Act, consent from the living is needed for storage and use of tissue for obtaining scientific or medical information which may be relevant to any persons, including a future person, public display, research in connections with disorders or functioning of the human body, and transplantation. Under the Act, consent from the living is not needed for storage and use of tissues for clinical audit, educational training relating to human health, performance assessment, public health monitoring and quality assurance. Consent to treatment and examination is covered by common law. Under the Act, consent is needed for the removal, storage and use of material from the deceased for all scheduled purposes. Although consent is not required for a coroner's post-mortem, consent is required under the Human Tissue Act for the continued storage or use of the tissue for a scheduled purpose once the coroner's purposes are complete. The Human Tissue Authority encourages the taking of informed and generic consent at the outset as the default position. The Code says that it is accepted as good practice to seek broad consent to store and use tissue or data prospectively in a number of future projects, potentially in a range of research fields. The principle of broad consent has been endorsed in parliamentary debates. It may not be possible to give donors specific information about the projects that will be carried out using the samples, but information sheets should give an indication of the types of research that might be conducted and the potential benefits. This slide shows a flowchart from the MRC toolkits relating to consent for research, and it explains under which circumstances consent is required when taking samples from the living for the purposes of research. Regarding consent for research when using samples from the deceased, it is required for research involving both identifiable and anonymous samples of human tissue from the deceased, including histology blocks and sides. And this is true unless the following exemptions apply. That is, if the material has come from a person who died before 2006 and if 100 years have passed since their death. If the samples come from an existing holding, i.e. material held or stored prior to the commencement of the Act on the 1st of September 2006, or samples that have been imported or comes from an imported body. This slide shows a table from the Human Tissue Authority showing the requirements for consent and licensing and showing some of those exemptions that I've just mentioned. This table highlights when consent is required for different activities and when it's recommended as good practice. This table sets out similar requirements when, with regards to samples from the deceased. When taking consent, it's important to consider a number of different aspects. What is appropriate consent in terms of who may actually give the consent? What's valid consent? Has the consent been given voluntarily? Has the patient been appropriately informed about the terms of the consent? And do they have capacity to consent? The scope of consent. This may differ. As we've mentioned previously, the HTA suggests taking generic and enduring consent at the outset, but this may not always be the case. The duration of consent, which may differ. It could be for a specific time period or during consent, as suggested by the HTA. It's also important to consider withdrawal of consent and make this clear to those that are confirming their consent for a particular study. The format of consent. The Act does not specify, except for anatomical examination or public display, the format that the consent should be recorded. However, for anatomical examination or public display, this must be in writing. However, it's important to have clear documentation of the consent process, what the consent has been taken for, and the protocols for how it's been obtained.